There is a moment in every hidden story when the truth stops being something you carry alone. Not because you finally find the courage to explain it, but because someone sees the evidence of your struggle without you saying a word. In this fictional story, that moment begins quietly with a message your soulmate almost ignored. It was late in the evening when their phone lit up beside a half-finished cup of coffee. The room was dim except for the pale glow of the screen, and for several seconds, they simply stared at the notification. They had been trying not to think about you. They had told themselves they needed distance. They had convinced themselves that whatever existed between you could wait until another day. Then they opened the message. It wasn't a love confession. It wasn't an accusation. It was a small piece of information about something you had endured long before they knew your name. They read it once. Then again. And the expression on their face changed. Because suddenly, certain things about you that had once confused them began to make sense. The way you sometimes became quiet in the middle of a conversation. The way you apologized even when you had done nothing wrong. The way you could laugh with everyone in the room and still seem as though some private part of you was standing somewhere far away. They had mistaken your silence for distance. Now they wondered if it had actually been survival. And that question stayed with them. What else had you carried without telling anyone? They stood from the chair and walked toward the window. Outside, the street was almost empty. A car passed slowly beneath the street lamp, its headlights sliding across the wall before disappearing. Your soulmate placed one hand against the glass and looked into the darkness, but their mind was no longer outside. It was with you. They remembered the first time you met. They remembered something you said that seemed strangely ordinary at the time. I'm okay. 3 words. Nothing unusual. But now those words sounded completely different. They remembered the way you said them too quickly. And for the first time, they wondered whether "I'm okay" had ever really meant what they thought it meant. Their heart tightened not because they felt sorry for you, but because they suddenly realized they had been standing near a locked door without knowing someone was behind it. They wanted to knock. But they were afraid. Afraid that if they asked the wrong question, you would disappear behind that familiar smile again. So they did something unexpected. They called someone who knew you from before. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but when it ended, they didn't immediately put the phone down. They sat there staring at their hand. Because the story they had just heard wasn't the story they had imagined. There had been a season in your life when you had needed someone desperately, and instead of receiving comfort, you had learned how to become your own comfort. There had been nights when you had made difficult decisions without anyone cheering you on. There had been mornings when you walked into ordinary places carrying extraordinary weight, pretending that nothing was wrong. But there was one detail your soulmate couldn't stop thinking about. You had never used what happened to you as an excuse to become cruel. That was what shook them. They had expected to hear about bitterness. Instead, they heard about restraint. They had expected anger. Instead, they heard about the way you still helped people who didn't know what you had survived. And suddenly, the person they thought they knew became much larger in their mind. Not perfect. Not untouched. But stronger in a way they had never understood. The next morning, something changed. Your soulmate woke before their alarm. For a few moments, they lay still, staring at the ceiling. They reached for their phone. Your name was there. They opened your conversation. There were old messages between you, ordinary little exchanges that now seemed strangely precious. A joke you had sent. A question about their day. A simple, "Did you get home okay?" They scrolled through them slowly, noticing something they had never noticed before. You had always been checking on everyone else. When had anyone checked on you? Their thumb stopped moving. A memory returned. There had been one evening when you were both talking, and suddenly you had gone quiet. They had asked what was wrong. You smiled. Nothing. Just tired. They had accepted that answer. Now they wished they hadn't. Not because they were angry at themselves, but because they understood something painful. Sometimes the people who need tenderness most become experts at making sure nobody notices they need it. Your soulmate got out of bed. They walked to the kitchen. They poured water into a glass but forgot to drink it. Then their phone buzzed. It was you. Just 2 words. "Are you okay?" They stared at the screen. A strange sadness moved through them. Even after everything you had endured, you were still asking about them. They typed a response. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that too. Finally, they wrote something simple. "I'm okay. But I need to ask you something." They hesitated before sending it. The message went through. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Appeared again. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Your soulmate watched the screen as though the answer might somehow reveal itself through the silence. And then your reply arrived. "What do you want to know?" They read it several times. There it was. The doorway. But they still didn't know whether opening it would bring you closer or make you finally walk away. They typed. "What happened to you?" The question remained on the screen. Their finger hovered over send. Then they changed it. "What did you have to survive?" They sent it. And immediately wished they could take it back. Not because they didn't want the truth. Because they suddenly understood that the truth might hurt them too. Across town, you saw the message. You didn't answer. You simply placed the phone face down. The room became very quiet. For a long time, you stood beside the table, staring at nothing. You had spent years learning how to keep certain memories folded away so tightly that even you rarely touched them. Not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. You knew what would happen if you opened that door. You would remember the room. The voices. The uncertainty. The moment you realized nobody was coming. You closed your eyes. And then you noticed something you hadn't expected. You weren't afraid of being judged anymore. You were afraid of being loved after the truth was known. Because there is a particular kind of vulnerability in discovering that someone has seen the worst chapters of your life and still chooses to stay. That kind of love cannot be controlled. And you had become very good at controlling what people were allowed to see. Your phone buzzed again. You didn't touch it. It buzzed a second time. Still, you waited. Then came a third message. This one was different. I don't need every detail. I just want to understand why you've been so hard on yourself. Your breath caught. Because that was the question you had never learned how to answer. Why were you so hard on yourself? Why did you believe you had to earn rest? Why did kindness toward yourself feel almost undeserved? Why did you instinctively prepare for people to leave even when they gave you reasons to stay? You picked up the phone. Your eyes filled with tears, but you didn't let them fall. You began typing. I don't know how to explain it. Your soulmate answered almost immediately. Then don't explain it perfectly. You stared at those words. Something inside you loosened. Not completely. Just enough. You began telling them one small thing. Then another. Not the whole story. Not yet. But enough for them to understand that your past had not simply been difficult. It had changed the way you trusted. It had changed the way you loved. It had changed the way you looked at yourself. Your soulmate read every message slowly. They didn't interrupt. They didn't offer easy answers. They didn't tell you that everything happened for a reason. They simply stayed. And that was when the emotional ground beneath the story shifted. Because you expected them to feel sorry for you. Instead, they became angry not at you, but at the fact that someone had once convinced you that you were difficult to love. They put the phone down and whispered to an empty room. How did nobody see this? Then another thought came. How had they missed it too? The realization was painful. But it also awakened something in them. They no longer wanted to be someone who admired your strength from a safe distance. They wanted to know the person underneath it. The person who didn't always have the answer. The person who sometimes needed reassurance. The person who had learned to smile while carrying things nobody could see. That evening, they came to the place where they knew they might find you. You were sitting alone beneath a row of quiet trees, watching the last light fade between the branches. When you saw them approaching, you immediately looked away. They stopped several feet from you. For a moment, neither of you spoke. Then they said your name softly. You looked up. Their eyes were different. There was no curiosity in them now. No suspicion. No judgment. Only recognition. They sat beside you, leaving enough space for you to decide whether you wanted them closer. I know I can't change what happened, they said. You swallowed. I know. And I know I can't ask you to forget it. You looked toward the fading sky. I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't. That answer made you turn. They looked directly at you. I feel something else. You waited. They took a slow breath. I feel honored that you trusted me enough to let me see even a small part of it. Your eyes dropped. For several seconds, the only sound was the wind moving through the leaves. Then they reached into their pocket. There was something inside they had brought for you. Not a gift. Not flowers. A folded piece of paper. They placed it beside you. You looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" They said, "Something I wrote after I learned the truth." Your hands trembled slightly as you unfolded it. There were only a few lines. You read the first. Then the second. And by the time you reached the final sentence, your entire expression had changed. Because they hadn't written that they loved your strength. They hadn't written that your pain made you special. They had written something far more dangerous to the walls you had built around your heart. They wrote that they wanted to know who you were when you no longer had to be strong. You looked up at them. And for the first time, they didn't look away. But there was still one thing you hadn't told them. One part of the story they hadn't discovered. One truth buried beneath everything they had just learned. And when they reached for your hand, you almost told them. Almost. Then your phone rang. You glanced at the screen. Your face went completely still. Your soulmate noticed. "Who is it?" You didn't answer. Because the name on the screen belonged to someone from the chapter of your life you had never planned to reopen. And your soulmate had no idea that the person calling was connected to the very secret you had been protecting all along. The call kept ringing. Once. Twice. 3 times. You finally looked at your soulmate and whispered, "If I answer this, everything changes." They looked at the phone. Then at you. And quietly said, "Then don't face it alone." You pressed accept. And the voice on the other end spoke your name. The next words made your soulmate's expression change completely. Because they realized the truth they had just learned wasn't the end of your story. It was only the beginning. The voice on the phone was older than the memory you had attached to it. For a moment, you couldn't speak. Your soulmate watched your face carefully, noticing the tiny change around your eyes, the way your fingers tightened around the phone, the way your breathing became shallow. "It's been a long time," the voice said. You turned slightly away. "Yes." The word barely escaped you. Your soulmate didn't ask who it was. They simply stayed beside you, listening without intruding. Then the voice said something you hadn't expected. "I found the letter." Your entire body went still. The world around you seemed to become strangely distant, the wind, the traffic beyond the trees, even the sound of your own breathing. "What letter?" Your soulmate looked at you. The voice continued. "The one you thought was destroyed." You closed your eyes. For years, you had believed that piece of paper was gone. You had watched it disappear from your life and convinced yourself that the words written on it no longer mattered. But apparently, someone had kept it. And now it had returned. You ended the call without saying goodbye. Your soulmate waited. They didn't demand an explanation. Instead, they asked quietly, "Do you want to tell me what that letter means?" You looked down at your hands. "It was written during the worst year of my life." "What did it say?" You hesitated. Then you gave the answer you had avoided for years. "It said what I couldn't say out loud." The silence between you changed. Your soulmate leaned forward, elbows resting against their knees. "And who wrote it?" You looked toward the darkening sky. "I did." That answer surprised them. You explained that the letter wasn't meant for another person. It was meant for yourself. You had written it on a night when you felt invisible, exhausted, and completely misunderstood. You had written down every thought you were too afraid to speak. Every disappointment. Every question. Every promise you made to yourself. And at the very bottom, you had written one sentence. Your soulmate asked what it was. You couldn't say it. Not yet. Instead, you whispered, I wrote that someday, if someone truly loved me, I would give them the letter. Your soulmate looked at you. Why didn't you? A faint smile crossed your face. Because nobody ever stayed long enough. Those words landed harder than anything else you had said. Your soulmate looked away. Not because they were uncomfortable. Because they were trying to hide what was happening inside them. They had imagined love as something dramatic before. Grand gestures. Perfect timing. Beautiful promises. But sitting beside you, they understood something different. Real love sometimes begins when someone decides not to leave during the quietest part of another person's truth. They turn toward you. I don't want the letter tonight. You looked surprised. Why? Because I don't want you to give it to me because you're afraid I'll leave. Your eyes filled. I want you to give it to me when you know I won't. For the first time that evening, you had no response. And somewhere deep inside, something you had protected for years began to shift. Not because the past had changed. Because the future suddenly looked less predictable. But the mystery surrounding the letter still remained. And there was something your soulmate hadn't understood yet. The letter wasn't the only thing that had survived that difficult year. There was another person. Someone who had witnessed everything. Someone who knew exactly why you had become so careful with your heart. The next morning, your soulmate received an unexpected call. It came from the same person who had contacted you the night before. They answered reluctantly. Hello? There was a pause. Then the voice said, you need to know something before you decide what you want with them. Your soulmate's expression hardened. What? I was there. Those 3 words changed everything. I was there when it happened, the voice continued. And they never told you the worst part. Your soulmate sat down. What worst part? The person hesitated. Then came an answer that forced your soulmate to reconsider everything they thought they knew about your past. You weren't the first person they tried to trust. The room became silent. There had been someone before. Someone you had loved deeply. Someone who had promised to protect the most vulnerable parts of you. Instead, that person had taken the things you confessed in confidence and used them against you. Not publicly. Not dramatically. In smaller ways. A comment made at the wrong moment. A private weakness mentioned during an argument. A secret turned into leverage. A vulnerability transformed into proof that you were somehow difficult. Your soulmate listened without speaking. And suddenly, all those moments when you had pulled away made sense. You weren't afraid of love. You were afraid of giving someone information they could someday use to hurt you. That distinction broke something open inside them. Because they realized the question was never, why don't you trust me? The real question was, what happened to make trust feel expensive? Your soulmate ended the call. Then they did something unexpected. They didn't come looking for you. They didn't demand another conversation. They gave you space. Because for the first time, they understood that loving you didn't mean constantly reaching for you. Sometimes it meant proving that your boundaries were safe. Hours passed. Then your phone received a message. I heard something about your past today. I'm not going to repeat it. If you want me to know, you'll tell me yourself. You stared at the message. Then another appeared. And if you never tell me, I will still respect you. You sat down. That was the moment the walls inside you became harder to maintain. Because you had prepared yourself for someone to demand explanations. You hadn't prepared yourself for patience. You called them. They answered immediately. Neither of you spoke for several seconds. Then you said, "Why aren't you asking?" Because it's your story. But you want to know. Yes. Then why don't you push? Because I want the truth from your heart, not from your fear. You covered your mouth. A tear finally escaped. Not because you were broken. Because someone had finally understood the difference between reaching for you and cornering you. You told them about the person from your past. You told them what happened. You told them how, afterward, you had started editing yourself. You became careful with your words. Careful with your hopes. Careful with affection. You stopped asking people to stay. You stopped expecting people to understand. And eventually, you convinced yourself that needing less would make losing less painful. Your soulmate listened until you finished. Then they said something you would remember for the rest of your life. You shouldn't have had to become smaller just to feel safe. You closed your eyes. For years, you had believed healing meant becoming strong enough not to need anyone. Now someone was offering you a completely different possibility. Maybe healing meant learning that needing someone did not make you weak. Maybe love wasn't supposed to demand that you erase your history. Maybe the right person wouldn't be frightened by the places in you that still needed gentleness. But there was one final piece of the story. And this time, it belonged to your soulmate. They had been hiding something too. You noticed it when you met again. They seemed distracted. Restless. As though they were carrying a decision they hadn't yet made. What aren't you telling me? They looked at you. For a moment, they smiled. Then the smile disappeared. I found something. What? They reached into their bag and removed an old envelope. Your heart stopped. You recognized the handwriting immediately. It was yours. The letter. The one you believed had vanished. But your soulmate wasn't holding it with triumph. They were holding it with trembling hands. I didn't open it, they said. You stared at the envelope. Where did you get that? They looked down. The person who called you gave it to me. Your stomach tightened. Why? Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. Instead, they turned the envelope over. There was something written on the back. A date. And beneath it, a sentence. You stepped closer. You knew that sentence. You had written it years ago. But you had forgotten what came after it. Your soulmate finally looked at you. I think this letter wasn't only about what happened to you. You felt your heartbeat quicken. What was it about? They handed you the envelope. Your fingers shook as you opened it. The paper inside was yellowed with age. You unfolded it. And the first lines brought memories rushing back. But halfway down the page, you stopped. Your eyes locked onto a name. A name you had never told your soulmate. A name connected to the night everything changed. Their eyes followed yours. You know them, you whispered. Your soulmate's face became pale. Yes. You looked up. Neither of you moved. Because suddenly, the past was no longer something sitting safely behind you. It had been standing much closer than either of you realized. And as your soulmate reached for the page, you saw something that made your blood run cold, not from fear, but from disbelief. Their name was written there too. Not as someone you had known. Not as someone from your past. But as someone you had once been warned about. Someone whose role in your story had never been explained. Your soulmate looked at you. I need to tell you something. You couldn't breathe. They folded the letter carefully. Then they said the words that changed the entire meaning of your meeting. I knew about you before we ever met. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether your soulmate could accept your past. The question was why they had been brought into it long before you ever knew they existed. There was one final page. Your soulmate hadn't read it. Neither had you. And when you turned it over, there was only one sentence. A sentence written years before your paths crossed. A sentence that seemed impossible. It said, "Someday, the person who finds this will be the one I was never able to find myself." You looked at your soulmate. They looked at you. And neither of you could explain how those words had been waiting for this exact moment. But then your soulmate noticed something beneath the sentence. A signature. Their own name. And they whispered, "I didn't know you knew my name back then." You stared at the page. Because you didn't. You had never seen that name before. Not until tonight. And that meant someone else had written the final line. Someone who had known both of you. Someone who had been watching the story unfold from the beginning. And before either of you could speak, the lights across the street suddenly went dark. Your phone vibrated. One new message. No number. No name. Only 4 words. You finally found each other. And beneath them was a photograph. A photograph of you and your soulmate together. Taken before you had ever met. For several seconds, neither of you moved. The photograph remained on the screen. You looked at it again. Then again. It showed the two of you standing together outside a small cafe, laughing about something neither of you could remember. The image looked ordinary, almost harmless. Except for one impossible detail. You hadn't met yet on the date printed beneath the photograph. Your soulmate took the phone from your hand. Their eyes narrowed as they examined the timestamp. This can't be real. You wanted to agree. You wanted to dismiss it as some cruel trick. But deep inside, another part of you already knew there was an explanation. Not a supernatural explanation. Not a perfect explanation. A human one. And somehow, that made the mystery even more painful. Your soulmate opened the image details. There was no hidden account. No mysterious location. No anonymous profile. Only one piece of information that neither of you expected. The photograph had been uploaded years earlier by someone you both knew. The person who had been carrying your letter. The person who had known both of your names. You finally understood. The secret wasn't that someone had predicted your future. The secret was that someone had quietly connected two broken pieces of a story long before either of you was ready to recognize the connection. Your soulmate looked at you. Do you know who took this? You nodded slowly. I think I do. And suddenly, the memory returned. Years ago, during the hardest season of your life, there had been one person who never tried to fix you. They simply listened. They had seen you write the letter. They had watched you fold it. And before you left, you had asked them to keep it. Not because you wanted them to give it away. Because you were afraid that someday you might forget who you were before everything changed. That person had kept the letter. But they had also met your soulmate long before you realized it. They had seen something in both of you that neither of you could see in yourselves. Not destiny. Not magic. Something much more human. Recognition. Two people who had learned to protect themselves in completely different ways, yet somehow understood the same loneliness. Your soulmate sat beside you. So they knew. You nodded. They knew we would meet? You shook your head. No. I think they only hoped we would. That distinction changed everything. The photograph wasn't proof that someone had controlled your lives. It was proof that someone believed your story didn't have to end where your pain had begun. Your soulmate looked down at the letter. Then they asked the question that had been waiting between you all night. What did you write on that final page? You took the paper from them. Your fingers moved carefully as you unfolded it. There was a section you had completely forgotten. You began reading. You had written about the kind of person you hoped to become. Not the person you wanted to find. The person you wanted to become. You wrote that you hoped one day you would stop measuring your worth by who stayed. You hoped you would stop believing that being abandoned meant you were unworthy. You hoped you would learn that a person's inability to love you properly was not evidence that you were impossible to love. And then came the sentence that made your soulmate close their eyes. You had written, "If someone ever learns everything I've been through, I hope they don't love me because they feel sorry for me. I hope they love me because they can see who I became afterward." Your soulmate looked at you. Their eyes were wet. That's exactly what I see. You couldn't answer. They continued. I don't love you because of what happened to you. They paused. I love you because of what you chose to become after it. The words didn't erase the past. They didn't magically repair every scar. But they reached somewhere inside you that explanations had never reached. Because you had spent so long believing your history was evidence against you. Someone was finally seeing it as context. Not a definition. Not a sentence. Context. You looked down at your hands. I was scared you would see me differently. I do. Your heart sank. Then they smiled. I see you more clearly. The tension that had lived inside you for years began to release. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It happened quietly. Like a door opening in a room that had been closed for too long. You leaned back. For the first time, you didn't feel the need to explain every silence. You didn't need to prove that you deserved tenderness. You didn't need to perform strength. You simply existed beside someone who knew more than they had known yesterday and still chose to remain. Then your soulmate reached for the letter. We should return this. You looked at them. To the person who kept it? Yes. Why? Because they carried our history long enough. The next afternoon, you went together. The person who had kept the letter was waiting. Older now. Quieter. They looked at the two of you walking through the door together and smiled before either of you said a word. I wondered how long it would take. You frowned. How long what would take? For you to stop running from the same truth. Your soulmate glanced at you. You laughed softly. It was the first time that entire journey had felt light. The person looked at the letter. You finally read it. You nodded. I did. And? You thought for a moment. It wasn't really about finding someone. They smiled. No. It was about finding myself. Their eyes softened. Now you understand. You placed the letter in their hands. They didn't open it. They simply held it against their chest. You don't need this anymore. You looked surprised. They handed it back. You wrote it when you were trying to survive. Keep it now that you know you can live. You took it. And that sentence became the final gift of that chapter. Not forgetting. Not pretending. Keeping the evidence of where you had been while refusing to remain trapped there. Later that evening, you and your soulmate walked home together. The city was glowing beneath the evening sky. People passed without knowing anything about the story unfolding between you. A child laughed somewhere across the street. A bus rolled through the intersection. Music drifted from an open window. Everything looked ordinary. And somehow, ordinary felt beautiful. Your soulmate reached for your hand. This time, you didn't hesitate. You know what I realized? They asked. What? I thought learning your past would make me understand why you were afraid of love. You looked at them. But now I think I understand something else. What? You weren't afraid of love. They squeezed your hand. You were waiting for a kind of love that didn't require you to disappear. You stopped walking. Those words reached deeper than they could have known. Because that had been the hidden truth all along. You didn't need someone to rescue you. You didn't need someone to rewrite your history. You needed someone who could stand beside the person you had already fought so hard to become. Your soulmate turned toward you. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. You smiled. Neither can I. I can't promise I'll always know what you need. I don't either. But I can promise I'll ask. You nodded. And I'll listen. For a moment, neither of you spoke. Then you stepped closer. The embrace that followed wasn't dramatic. There was no perfect music. No crowd. No extraordinary sign in the sky. Just two people standing beneath a street lamp, holding each other after finally understanding how much courage it had taken to arrive there. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part. Love hadn't arrived to erase your wounds. It had arrived willing to know them. Your soulmate had learned what you had been through. And their reaction said everything. They didn't retreat. They didn't treat you like something fragile. They didn't make your past the center of your identity. They simply looked at you and saw a whole person. Someone who had struggled. Someone who had changed. Someone who had survived difficult chapters without allowing those chapters to write the ending. And you finally understood something too. The person who belongs in your life won't necessarily be the one who knows every detail immediately. They may not understand everything at first. They may misunderstand you sometimes. They may need you to explain. But the right person will care enough to learn. They will not demand that you become less complicated so they can love you more easily. They will not ask you to hide your history so they can enjoy your present. They will meet you where honesty begins. And when the truth finally arrives, they will decide whether to walk away or walk closer. Your soulmate walked closer. Not because your story was perfect. Because it was real. That night, before you went to sleep, you placed the old letter inside a drawer. Not hidden. Not destroyed. Simply placed somewhere safe. Then you turned off the light. For the first time in years, you didn't replay the past before closing your eyes. You thought about tomorrow. And that small difference meant everything. Because healing isn't always a dramatic transformation. Sometimes healing is simply realizing you are no longer waiting for the past to give you permission to live. Sometimes it is allowing someone to know you completely without immediately preparing yourself to lose them. Sometimes it is holding someone's hand and realizing that you don't have to predict the ending before you enjoy the moment. And sometimes the greatest answer isn't found in discovering why something painful happened. It is found in realizing that the painful chapter did not get the final word. So if this fictional story found a quiet place in your heart, let its message remain with you tonight. Your past can explain you without defining you. What happened to you can matter without owning you. And the love you deserve will never require you to pretend that you have never been hurt. May you be surrounded by people who recognize the person beneath your defenses. May you find the courage to speak when silence has become your shelter. May you learn to receive kindness without wondering what it will cost you later. May the next chapter of your life be gentler than the last. And when someone truly sees you, your history, your imperfections, your unanswered questions, your hopes, and the strength you built quietly, may you have the courage to believe that being fully known does not have to end in rejection. Perhaps the most beautiful surprise waiting for you is not someone who discovers that you have suffered. It is someone who discovers everything you have become and chooses to stay. If this story spoke to your heart, take a moment to breathe, hold on to the hope that your next chapter can be different, and remember that you are allowed to begin again. And if you want more cinematic stories of love, hope, healing, and unexpected second chances, stay connected to this channel, subscribe, and come back for the next story. Until then, may your heart find peace, may your path become clearer, and may the love that enters your life recognize your worth without asking you to prove it.